She didn't ask his name, nor why they'd been left behind. She simply took them in, like rescuing a charred scrap of wood adrift from a dying fire. Some stories begin with gunfire, but others only come alive when someone chooses not to walk away. Out on the scorched land where stone split beneath the heat, a pregnant widow knelt beside three figures, a man and two children, abandoned like ghosts in the desert. She hadn't meant to save anyone. Her heart, though heavy with loss, still held enough warmth not to look away. But when she touched the trembling hand of the smallest child, she caught sight of a faint scar across the man's neck, the kind left by a rope, as if he'd been hanged and somehow survived. Who had left them? Why? She didn't ask. But her eyes locked onto his as though seeking answers in the silence of her own soul. Naomi always rose before the roosters, not because sleep didn't matter, but because of the wind. Western wind didn't knock. It slipped through every gap in the wall, howling like it missed someone long dead. She curled beneath her worn wool blanket, her belly rising like a weight lashed tight to every breath. On the stove, the water hadn't boiled. The kindling burned uneven. Each morning, Naomi coaxed the fire back to life, as if trying to rebuild something already gone. Some days the flame caught quick, some days just smoke. Like people. Outside, dawn hadn't broken. A tree had fallen in the night. She'd heard its groan, the snap, then the hush. That hush, that was what wore a soul thin. Naomi hadn't spoken a word in 2 days. But then there was no one to speak to. And if there had been, she wasn't sure she remembered how to start. The cabin was no larger than a hand stretched wide, but every inch was orderly. The stove tucked against the wall, the bed by the window, a few white enamel cups hanging from the beam. One of them was always turned upside down, never used, yet cleaned each evening as if someone still needed it. A man's old shirt still hung from a wooden peg. Naomi had never washed it, not out of longing for its scent, but because she couldn't bring herself to change something that had already stopped changing. Her belly had grown heavy. She moved slowly now, shoulders tilting back for balance, but her legs were steady, like the trunk of a tree long accustomed to wind. Naomi didn't wear rouge, didn't fuss with her hair, didn't read romance novels. The only book she touched was a small, worn Bible. The spine cracked, the pages faded. Not out of faith, but because she needed something to read, something to drown out the noise in her head. Each meal she served just one portion, yet she always set out an extra bowl, as if teaching the unborn child that it would not be alone, or perhaps teaching herself to believe it. The days moved like dust rains, never heavy, never ending. Naomi chopped wood, boiled water, made root broth. To anyone else it would look like nothing, but to her it was survival, not just of the body, but of the reason to go on. She didn't plant flowers. There was no point. Nothing soft could survive the night winds. But on the windowsill, a small stone lay beside a cracked seashell. 2 useless, nameless things. Yet they remained, like 2 souls no one had to explain. Each night, Naomi sat on the steps, gazing toward the stretch of road no one had traveled that season. She wasn't expecting anyone, but the door stayed unlocked, like a reflex, like her heart still held one opening where the light might reach. The child within her kicked, soft. She laid a hand across the rise and said nothing. The wind rose sharper, her belly tightened, and she stayed there longer than usual. Not waiting, just making sure that if someone ever wandered through the wind, they would see the faint light in that little house, and know someone still lived there, still waited, not for anyone in particular, just for someone. Someone quiet enough not to frighten her. Someone who had lost something, too, just like her. Noon came late, but the sun didn't wait. It slipped through the cracks in the door, casting the warped shadow of the awning onto the wooden floor like the edge of a thin blade. Naomi sat in the kitchen, stirring a pot of watery porridge. She wasn't hungry, but not cooking wasn't an option. She set the spoon down and sat still, listening to water drip slowly from the wooden bucket. In that house, the only sounds came from things that didn't feel. The drip of water, the hiss of wind, the creak of old boards. People were silent. Naomi didn't cry. She had no tears left. Or maybe nothing felt worthy of them anymore. The past had drifted off. The future hadn't yet arrived. Sometimes she forgot she was pregnant, not because she didn't love the child, but because of fear. Fear of naming something that might never exist. Fear of digging another grave behind the house. Outside, the tree that fell in last night's wind still lay there. She hadn't the strength to drag it in, but she couldn't leave it too long either. Snakes liked a damp shade to lay eggs. Nothing on this land was done for beauty, only to survive. A sparrow landed on the porch step, its head tilted, feathers puffed against the cold. Naomi didn't move toward it, but she placed some dry breadcrumbs by the doorway, then turned away. When she looked again, the crumbs were gone. The bird, too, only a faint footprint remained in the dust. Like a thank you left unsaid, a clatter came from the shed. Naomi reached slowly for the rifle hanging from the beam. But she didn't shoot, just a thin fox, drawn by the scent of bones drying on the back hooks. She knocked the rifle stock against the wood post. The fox slinked off. No blood needed, only boundaries. Evening brought a trace of dampness. Wind from the south carried the smell of smoke, maybe from a field burn, maybe someone's home lost its fire. Naomi lit hers early, not for hunger, but so the house would carry the smell of smoke, the one thing that made this place feel like someone lived here. When the sun fell, she sat beside the window, tracing the old cracks in the wood frame, a habit born of silence. Near the sill was one straighter piece of timber, less cracked than the others. She'd saved it to build a cradle, but hadn't touched it. Not yet, not until she was sure the child would come. Tonight's moon was a thin crescent. Its light spilled across the dirt floor like a line of cold water. She looked out. No one came, no hoofbeats, no footsteps, and still Naomi left the door ajar, not to invite, not to hope, but to remind herself. Even living alone, she was not the last soul on earth who remembered how to leave a door open. And that was the smallest beginning of a trust that didn't yet have a name. Dawn didn't rise the way it usually did. Light broke slow, like someone struggling to rise after a long, hard night. The wind was soft, but the sand still scraped the skin like tiny needles. Naomi rose early, her shoulders aching, legs tingling under the familiar weight. She folded the blanket slowly, poured water into the blackened pot, and slung her basket over one shoulder. Today was for gathering wood. Not far and just around the edge of the hill, where a tree had snapped in last week's wind. She tied a cloth across her belly, stepped past the brittle line of cypress, her boots pressing into soil cracked like fish scales left too long in the sun. The patch behind the western fence was usually uneventful. A few thorny shrubs, some deer tracks, a thin trail of lingering rain. But today, something was different. Naomi stopped cold when she saw a still shape near the rusted barbed wire. A man, his head hung low, bare back blistered under the sun, arms bound tight to a fence post with twisted wire. Two children, smaller, lay curled at his feet. One had his arm draped across the man's chest, clinging to what breath remained, like it might hold his father in this world. Naomi didn't move for several long seconds, seconds that felt like the length of a life. Wind blew strands of her hair across her eyes, the scent of blood and sun-seared flesh. hung in the air. Nearby, half buried in the grass, a rusted brass badge gleamed faintly. An eagle etched into its face. She recognized it, Iron Claw, the roving bandits of the borderlands who lived by stealing horses and hunting those who fled. She stepped closer. Her basket slipped from her hand, tumbling into the dry grass. Nearer now, she saw bruises blooming along the man's arm. His lip was split, eyes closed. Alive or not, she couldn't tell. The older child, perhaps 8, maybe 9, was still breathing, but shallow and ragged. His face burned, hair matted to his forehead. He opened his eyes, looked at Naomi, and whispered, voice dry and defiant, "Don't let them take Pa's horse." The younger one was curled tight like a crumpled cloth, hands bleeding where the wire had bitten in. Naomi knelt by the fence. Her belly tightened, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of it. She laid a hand to the earth, cold, dry, unmoving. No hoof prints leading away, no wagon tracks, just 3 human beings, left behind like objects no longer worth the trouble. A scrap of cloth caught in the wire, embroidered with the faded word Durango, a clue from some faraway place. Her heart pounded in her ears. No decent soul came from a place that would do this. Naomi didn't cry. She simply looked at those 3 bodies as if seeing something she herself had once lost, but this time still breathing. No voice called out. No one begged for help. Only 3 broken bodies, and a pregnant woman standing alone, watching them, then walking forward. And for the first time in many months, Naomi had to believe in something greater than fear, that someone, even a stranger, even bruised and filthy, still deserved to live, and that she, though once hollowed by loss, might still be someone who could keep another soul in this world. Naomi didn't ask who they were, didn't ask what had happened, didn't look around for signs of whoever had done this. She simply knelt, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from pain. Barbed wire doesn't come free easy, especially when it's been baked into flesh by hours of sun. Naomi lifted the hem of her cloak, wrapped it around her hand, and began unwinding the coils from the smallest boy's wrists. His skin was scraped raw, the wire biting deep and leaving a bruised black ring where dried blood had crusted over. She didn't cry out, didn't complain, but each time the steel grazed her hand, it left a red sting across her skin. Quiet reminders written in flesh. She lifted the youngest child first. Light, his bones jutting like bare twigs. Her belly caught. A small contraction came. She leaned to the side, drew a sharp breath, and kept moving. At the cabin, she laid him gently on a straw mat covered with an old coat, then turned back. No pause. No wiping the blood from her hands. The older boy was harder, his limbs stiff from sun exposure, wounds bleeding where the wire had sunk deep. Naomi gritted her teeth, sawed the last loop free with a dull blade. Her fingers were swollen now, blood seeping through the cloth she had wrapped around her palm. When she reached the man still unconscious, she bent lower. His shoulders hung limp, his body slack in the wire's grip. His hands were clenched tight, as if still gripping the last thread of life. She didn't know how she got him to the cabin. Maybe it was one step at a time, resting often by the cypress roots. Or maybe it was instinct. To keep someone alive, even barely, was reason enough. Evening came slow, casting red light through the cabin window. Naomi placed a warm cloth on the smaller boy's forehead, fed him spoonfuls of water with quiet patience. The man was still unconscious. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, murmuring something she couldn't quite make out. A name, maybe, a prayer, or a word meant for the dead. She didn't ask. She simply reached out and brushed his hair back, a slow, steady motion, done without thought. Not to comfort him, but to remind herself this was real. This man was still alive. Naomi sat upright, eyes fixed on the stove. where the pot let off a soft roll of steam. Wind slipped through the wall seams, bringing with it the smell of warm ash. She didn't know what she'd just done, didn't know what tomorrow would be. All she knew was this: 3 people were breathing, and she, though never one to believe in miracles, was not cold enough to turn away when one knocked gently at her door. Trust doesn't come from answers. It begins in the smallest of acts, like cutting a man free who's never spoken your name, and staying instead of walking away. The first night with 3 strangers in the little house, and everything changed, though not with noise, only in the silences. The wind still hissed through the cracks in the wall, but this time Naomi wasn't the only one listening to its breath. On the floor near the hearth, 3 bodies lay close, separated only by 2 thin wool blankets. Naomi tucked a cushion under the youngest boy's feet. He had a low fever, fingers scratching at the blanket like searching for something that had gone missing. The water pot on the stove had been changed 3 times. Mint leaves boiled until the water turned color, the scent of their bitterness mixing with the smell of tired skin, blood, and burnt wood. The smell of survival. Naomi sat beside them, hand resting on her belly. The child inside her gave a soft kick, a small reminder it was still there. She shifted slightly, pain catching in her lower back, but she didn't groan. Just pulled the small chair closer, dipped the cloth again, placed it on the older boy's forehead. A bat flitted across the roof. Naomi looked up, not startled, just listening. The man remained unconscious, his eyes closed, his chest lifted in slow, uneven breaths. She placed one hand near his ribs, not touching, just close enough to know he was still alive. The smaller boy whimpered in sleep. Naomi leaned down to adjust his blanket, and in that small moment, whether it was the firelight or something quieter, something private, she exhaled, slow and full, like she hadn't let herself breathe for someone else in a long, long time. Near midnight, Naomi stood, fetched an extra cloth, wedged it into the doorframe, and stepped outside. The wind had shifted. The air carried dust and dampness. Rain might come sooner than the season allowed. She didn't walk the yard, didn't circle the house, just leaned her back against the rear wall, where the darkness was thickest and silence most complete. She didn't look at the sky, didn't close her eyes, she only listened. No footsteps, no cries. Just a quiet night, strange enough to feel nearly suspicious. When she stepped back inside, Naomi passed the 3 sleeping forms. In the flicker of firelight, she saw something this house hadn't held in many months, the warmth of bodies not her own. She returned to her chair, hands wrapped around an empty wooden cup. She didn't drink, just held it, needing to keep something in her hands that felt real. In that silence, Naomi did not feel peace, but she felt enough to stay another night, enough to no longer be the only one awake, and enough to begin something that didn't yet need a name. The next morning, as Naomi washed her hands beneath the wooden spout, the fresh scrapes stung sharply in the cold water. She stared at them without blinking, as if they were proof, plain and raw, that the night before hadn't been a dream. Vengshu, youngest boy, woke first. He didn't cry, just opened his eyes, lips cracked dry, and slowly turned his head, like a young creature fallen from its nest. Naomi stepped over, knelt beside him, said nothing. She offered a cup of water. Only half full, enough that he wouldn't choke. His hand trembled, but he didn't pull away. She steadied it, and he drank every drop. Then, by instinct, the boy leaned into her. Not pleading, not calling her anything. He simply let himself go, as if his small body still remembered the rhythm of a safe heartbeat, beside an adult without the scent of harm. Naomi stayed still, her hand resting lightly on his back. 1 minute, 5, and he fell back asleep. As the morning light crept through the cracks in the cabin wall, the man stirred for the first time. He coughed, weak and dry, eyes tightening against the brightness before blinking halfway open. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, unfocused, then turned his head and saw Naomi, his brow tensed, part caution, part confusion. Naomi didn't move. She sat on the low stool, the wooden cup still in her hand. They looked at each other for a few silent seconds. "I thought I was dead." His voice was hoarse. It wasn't quite gratitude nor a question, just a truth, bare and unguarded. Naomi said nothing. She poured water, passed it to him. He tried to sit up, shoulders trembling, and drank. Small sips. She didn't ask his name, didn't ask what had happened. But when he spoke, his voice cracked. "We came from the east, camped near the river road. 3 men came. One had a gun etched with a cross. They wanted the horse. I said I had children. They laughed, then knocked me out. When I came to, I was tied like a dog, and someone had stepped on my child's hand." Naomi didn't blink, but something inside her broke, and quietly, without sound, he gasped, pain blooming in his ribs. Still, he kept talking. "I don't remember it all, just the heat, and thinking, if I don't die of thirst, I'll die because no one's coming." This time, Naomi spoke, softly. "I didn't come because I heard something. I came because it was too quiet." That made him look at her for a long time. And then, for the first time, in the dim light beneath a wooden roof, surrounded by ash and salt, they sat across from one another, not as strangers, but like 2 pieces of a world, long broken, meeting again along the cracks. And in that silence, it no longer felt frightening, because it held someone else. She was no longer alone. That noon, he tried to stand. Naomi stepped forward to steady him, but he shook his head, though his legs still trembled. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor through the window, and in that shaft of light, Naomi saw him clearly for the first time. Broad shoulders, sun-darkened arms, but along his back, a long scar. Not recent, the kind that had lived on a body for years, like the shape a past mistake leaves behind. He winced from the pain, but stayed upright. His eyes flicked toward the 2 children still asleep. His chest rose and fell, as if wrestling with something that had no words. Naomi stood still. She didn't ask. He spoke, not looking at her. "My name's Clay." Silence. Then, a moment later, as if each word carved inward like a knife turned on himself, "I was the one who walked away." Naomi froze slightly. "Walked away from my wife. She was having our first boy, and I was in Durango. Gambling. Didn't come back. She raised him alone. Got so thin she was barely a shadow. By the time I returned, she'd collapsed, next to the stove. And that boy, he was so hungry he tried to chew the hem of her dress." His voice wasn't loud, but each word tore, not out of rage, not seeking forgiveness, just telling it, plain. Naomi still didn't speak. "I took the boys because I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I ran far enough, lived right enough, maybe I could make it up somehow. But it seems some mistakes don't leave anyone untouched." He turned his back to her, as if unwilling to let anyone see the look in his eyes, then walked slowly out to the porch and leaned against the post. Naomi watched him, not out of pity, not even empathy, but because she understood. She had once lived beside a man who never apologized, not because he didn't know guilt, but because shame had hollowed him too deep to ask for forgiveness. Clay's shadow stretched across the dry earth like a sentence forgotten but never lifted. Naomi brought him a cup of water, set it gently on the step beside him, then turned and walked away. She didn't say a word, because sometimes silence is a way of saying, "I know," not "I know your guilt," but I know the weight of carrying it every day. And that was the first time in many long years Clay sat beside another soul without building a wall of excuses, just breathing, letting the past stay where it was, no longer swallowing him whole. Their first meal together passed in silence, not because there was nothing to say about Cain, but because no one wanted to shatter the fragile peace with unnecessary sound. Naomi set 2 wooden bowls on the table, corn porridge, thin, plain, just enough to divide among the 3 of them, the 2 children and their father. She didn't sit with them. She stood by the doorway, one shoulder resting against the frame, holding a worn ladle in her hand, watching to see if each of them could manage to eat. The older boy nodded in thanks. The younger was still too weak, and Naomi fed him each spoonful slowly, steadily. Clay, sitting slightly tilted to keep pressure off his wounded back, didn't look at her, but he ate slowly, evenly, like a man who understood the value of each bite prepared by someone else's hands. No one spoke. Only the soft tap of spoons against wood, the crackle of fire from the hearth, and the wind rattling the shutters. Sounds that once marked solitude now formed the quiet rhythm of something that almost resembled a life shared. When Clay rinsed the bowls at the water barrel out back, Naomi stepped out to the porch, sat on the sun-warmed step where the last light of evening had just dried the earth. He brought the clean bowl back, set it on the wooden table. She didn't thank him, he didn't speak. But as he turned to leave, Naomi said softly, more to the air than to him, "I used to think no one would ever set foot in this house again." Clay stopped, his back still turned to her. After a pause, he replied, "I used to think I wasn't worth anyone letting me stay." No argument, no comfort, just 2 people, each carrying their own kind of ruin, sitting nearer to one another than silence had ever allowed. That night, when the wind crept through the cracks in the walls, Naomi placed a basin of water near Clay's bed. He lay with eyes half closed, his head resting on a folded cloth. She didn't touch him, but she arranged the blanket close enough that he wouldn't need to brace himself. Before dimming the oil lamp, she glanced at the 2 children, now sleeping soundly, no dreams of thirst, no broken gasping breath like the night before. Naomi didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if Clay would leave once he healed, wasn't even sure she had the strength for one more attachment. But that night, as the last flicker of lamp flame quivered in the dark, she knew. A man who once believed he wasn't worth being kept might come to believe otherwise, because of a bowl of porridge, a cup of water, and a place to rest. And sometimes new trust doesn't need to rise from something grand. It only needs to begin with a meal shared and someone who chose to stay. The next morning, when Naomi went out to check the fence line near the ridge, she stopped cold. A section of the fence was skewed. The barbed wire had been cut, not torn but cleanly sliced with a blade. Footprints marked the dirt, 4, maybe 5 pairs of men's boots, larger than Clay's. No horse tracks. They had come on foot. She crouched down, fingers brushing a spent brass casing half hidden in the dry grass. Cold, hard, recent. When she returned to the cabin, her face had darkened. But she said nothing to Clay. She simply washed her hands, stoked the fire earlier than usual, boiled extra water, and checked the back door's latch. Clay saw, and he understood. When Naomi placed a freshly cleaned pistol on the windowsill, he finally spoke. "Someone come?" Naomi gave a slight nod. "Didn't come in, but they were close." His voice tensed. "I think it's them." Naomi didn't ask who. She just fetched a length of rope and tied the front door higher across the frame. One hand drifted to her belly, a reflex when worry crept in, as if to feel that the child inside her was still calm. That noon, Clay went to the stable, where Naomi's mare was usually tethered near the gate. The rope had been loosened. Boot prints circled the spot. The horse was still there, but someone had come too close. He returned to the house, his expression carved from stone. Naomi was feeding the youngest child. He waited for her to meet his eyes, then said slowly, "I think they're looking for me." Naomi sat upright. The child fell back asleep. She set the bowl down and wiped the boy's mouth. Without turning to Clay, her voice came steady. "They have reason." Clay stared at the wall behind her, where angled light fell across the wood. Then he said, as if confessing, "I stole from them once, back when I was drifting west after my wife died. I got reckless. That night I took the boys, crossed their line, thought I could outrun it." Naomi closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them, looked straight at him. "You're not running anymore." Clay met her gaze. She hadn't said it as blame, nor as blessing, just as if she were stating something that had already shifted. They fell silent. The wind picked up. Sand blew against the door. The little wooden house, once just a refuge for the left behind, had become a target for something that would return, this times with real danger. But sometimes only when another person lives in your house do you truly learn fear, not just to survive, but to keep something alive. And Clay, for the first time, began to think about staying to defend, not fleeing to survive. The afternoon passed heavy as ash. The sky held its color, but no one believed tomorrow would look like today. Naomi hung a black cloth behind the small back window, an old frontier signal women once passed between them. Tonight, no one leaves their house. Clay rebuilt the fence. The posts were driven deeper, wire pulled tight, his hands slick with old blood not yet scabbed, but he didn't stop. Not anymore for himself. Naomi broke kindling into smaller pieces, fed the hearth, pulled the jars of dried food in close. The child in her stirred, but this time she didn't reach to soothe it. She let it kick, as if to say, "Mama's still here." Night fell without a single dog's howl. The wind whipped across the roof, its howl like distant hooves, almost close enough to feel. But no one was out there, not yet. Naomi bolted the door. She took the small revolver from the drawer, checked each round, slow, steady, no shaking. Clay saw, but didn't ask. He'd already sharpened a length of hardwood, driven a metal bolt through the tip, and laid it beside the back door. In the small room, the two children slept, but it was a curled, guarded sleep. Their bodies already knew when the world outside was pulled taut like a drawn bow. Naomi sat on the front step. The oil lamp cast a ribbon of gold across her hair, not warm, but mournful. Clay came beside her and said quietly, "I didn't mean for you to carry this." Naomi looked directly at him. Her eyes held no blame, no rage, only resolve. "The loneliest night of my life wasn't the night I was beaten, wasn't when my husband died. It was the night I gave birth in an empty barn, alone. If tonight becomes the second time I face it all alone, I'll never forgive myself." Clay nodded, not quick, not promising, just accepting they were here, and neither was leaving tonight. Midnight, a branch snapped beyond the fence. Not the wind. Clay glanced over. Naomi was already standing. She placed a hand on the child's shoulder, a silent stay asleep, then picked up the gun and followed him. The door stayed shut. They stood behind the curtain, breath shallow but not panicked. 3 shadows moved past the fence. One muttered, then laughed, low and cruel. A voice rasped through the dark like stone on stone. "Clay, think you can hide from us? You took Iron Claw's horse. You'll pay in blood." Naomi gripped the revolver. Clay's hand clenched white around the shaft of his makeshift weapon. From the darkness, the older boy woke, crawled quietly beside Naomi. He whispered, voice trembling but trying hard to be brave. Pa once said, "There's an old song. When the wind stills, the good ones shoot first. Don't let them in, Miss Naomi." Naomi gave a small nod, eyes forward. She whispered back as if saying the old verse to steady her own heart. "The wind hasn't stilled, but we won't let them in." They waited. The shadows paused. One tossed a brass badge etched with an eagle into the yard. A final warning. Then footsteps drew back, vanished into wind, leaving only a ragged laugh. The kind that promised it wasn't over. When silence returned, Clay let the weapon drop from his hand. Naomi exhaled, slow and deep. She didn't collapse into her chair. She eased into it. Her legs still trembled, but they didn't back away. The child inside her kicked again. This time she placed her hand on her belly and gently patted. Clay sat beside her. Didn't touch her, didn't need to. And sometimes the fiercest kind of fight isn't bullets or blood. It's choosing to stay when you know danger will come again. It's sitting beside someone, not to shield them, but to face the night together. Because from now on, each night survived was no longer just time passing. It was a promise kept. Toward dawn, Naomi still hadn't slept. The fire had long since gone cold, leaving only flickers of ember. Tiny coals glowing like the last bits of storm ash, drifting through the dark. She sat motionless at the edge of the bed, one hand resting on her belly, as if feeling the stirring of the child within was the only thing keeping her from unraveling. The front door remained bolted, but Clay had opened a narrow slit in the curtain. He sat there, head leaning against the wood, his eyes hollow from a night without sleep. Beside him, the wooden shaft still bore dried blood. From his own hand, not from any intruder. The youngest boy, the frail one, woke crying, a sudden sharp sound. Naomi moved instinctively, but this time, Clay was there first. He picked up the child, hands clumsy but sure. The boy cried for a while in his arms, then slowly quieted, his eyes still wet as he burrowed into his father's chest. In his little fist, he clutched a scrap of fabric, a torn piece from his mother's dress, held like a sacred charm. "Mama said, if I hold it, she won't go away," he whispered, his voice soft but clear, as though he were making a vow to himself. Naomi stood nearby, not interfering, not stepping back, just witnessing. For the first time since entering this cabin, Clay didn't avoid her eyes. He said, as if confessing something to himself, "I didn't think I could be a father again." Naomi replied, her voice gentler than the wind, "No one thinks they're ready, not until a child needs them." He nodded, not to show strength, but to agree with something inside himself. She picked up a thin blanket, laid it softly across his shoulders, then turned away as if afraid to disturb the moment by moving too heavily. He didn't thank her. She didn't need him to. By the hearth, Naomi rekindled the coals. The older boy sat nearby, his eyes lighting up as she began to murmur an old folk tale. When her husband once told her, "Long ago there was a cavalryman lost in the desert. He sang a song about horses and wind to call his brothers back. 'Sing loud,' he said, 'for the wind will carry your voice to the right ears.'" The younger child smiled, mouthing along, even if the words weren't quite clear. Because some actions aren't born of kindness, but of something deeper, understanding. And in that small wooden cabin where silence had once been the only language, there was now a new way for people to believe in one another. A child, willing to stop crying in the arms of a father who once thought he'd lost the right. A woman, choosing to stay instead of locking the door. And an old story told by firelight, a way to remind them all. They were alive, and they were here, together. The sun rose late that day, not bright, not golden like honey, just enough light to see the dust drifting slowly in the morning air. Naomi stepped out back. The earth had dried again, splitting into fine lines like palm creases. She crouched down and with the tip of her finger gently smoothed over a fresh footprint, one left by a stranger the night before, not to erase it, but as if to cover an open wound showing through the skin of the land. Clay came out carrying a length of old rope. He saw what she was doing, said nothing, then came closer, set the rope down, and crouched beside her. I used to think scars were just the parts that couldn't be erased. Naomi kept her eyes on the ground. Then, after a moment, said, "They don't go away, but if you remember where it hurt, you walk slower when you return to it." They stood up together. Clay picked up a small spade and began rebuilding the fence again. Not because it was broken, but because now it was guarding something that mattered. Naomi didn't stop him. She fetched a pail of water and began tending the half-forgotten rows of corn, one she'd once abandoned thinking there would be no harvest. The older child wandered into the yard. He sat in the dirt, drawing crooked lines in the dust with a stick. He drew a house, a horse, and a woman holding a bowl. Clay looked over. He asked gently, "Is that your mother?" The boy shook his head, then pointed toward Naomi. Naomi stood a few paces away, unable to hear the exchange. But in Clay's eyes, surprise, confusion, and something deeper he didn't try to hide: gratitude. That afternoon, Naomi set 3 bowls on the table, just like every day, but this time she placed a small wooden one beside them. The child looked from his mother to his father, then ran over to the table. No one called him. No one invited. Clay pulled out a chair, no longer hesitant. Naomi ladled out the porridge. She didn't ask if anyone was hungry, because when a person sits down at a table of their own accord, it means they're starting to belong. In a world where everything can be taken: land, family, safety, a meal served on time, without urgency, without command, becomes the most sacred ritual of renewal. And Naomi understood this without being told, because she herself was learning how to believe again. One spoonful, one glance, one silence warmer than the day before. It didn't take much, just a child smiling as he sat at the table, and a man who no longer woke thinking about leaving come morning. The next morning the sky was strangely clear. No clouds, not even a breeze strong enough to stir the hair of the woman sitting beneath the porch eaves. Naomi was mending a saddle, the scent of worn leather, waxed thread, and time itself. Not fragrant things, but quiet, like the breath of a home just beginning to find its rhythm again. She worked without haste. Each stitch was firm, her eyes focused, but her thoughts wandered toward Clay and the 2 boys. She could hear the tap of a hammer behind the house, Clay fixing up a new rack. The older child was trying to chop wood, his swings uneven, but earnest. The little one sat in the dirt, drawing circles with a broken stick. No one asked anything. No one needed to be told. And yet, in that stillness, something had shifted. Naomi stood, dusted off her hands. The younger boy ran over, tugged at her skirt, and pointed to his drawing: a small house, 2 adults, 3 children, and a horse standing nearby. She crouched, ran her hand through his hair, soft, thin, a little gritty with sand, as if that one touch could tell him he was safe now. Clay approached, handing her a small bundle of wooden nails. "I figure we ought to reinforce the back door." Naomi looked at him, a look full of unspoken understanding. "Not I, but we, now." Clay smiled, not wide, but enough that the lines at the corners of his eyes looked less like barbed wire than they had the day before. That evening Naomi took her late husband's old shirt, and hung it outside to air. But this time she hung it beside another, Clay's shirt still streaked with dried blood and dust. She didn't put it away. She just let them hang there, side by side, as if both men, one gone, one still breathing, had earned a place in her life. When night came, she lit the fire again, not out of fear, but because the air had turned cold. And she knew, some fears don't vanish in the dark, but they step back when firelight warms the faces of those we care for. Clay sat nearby, one of the children sleeping against his shoulder. Naomi didn't need to hold anyone, nor be held. But the way her gaze settled on Clay and the boy, soft like a smile that never quite formed on her lips but was felt all the same, said more than any embrace. Sometimes it's not enough to let someone survive. You have to let them know they're alive. And let someone who once believed they merely existed understand that their presence now matters to someone else. In that wordless space where breath was louder than wind, Naomi understood. She was no longer alone, and neither was Clay. By early morning, no one slept in. The wind had shifted, carrying that distinct chill of the high plains when winter begins to press near. Naomi hung another heavy cloth over the window frame. She checked the firewood, dried corn, salted fat. Her hand paused over the small stack of cloth diapers she was stitching, preparing for a child whose arrival had no date. Clay was out at the stable, repairing the gate that had been broken for weeks. This time he used 3 layers of wood and a crossbar of bent iron, not from fear, but because he would be staying. And when a man chooses to stay, even the smallest things become worth fixing. The older child helped Naomi fold blankets. She didn't instruct him, and he didn't ask for praise. They simply did what people do when they're staying. They learned to do the right things without needing to be told. The younger one laughed as Clay lifted him from the saddle, setting him down with both hands. No more clumsy touches, no more sidelong glances. By noon the sky cleared. Naomi went to the well, drew water with her hands instead of the bucket. The cold made her shiver, but she left her fingers there longer than necessary, as if to ask herself, is this life real? A man who once ran for his life, 2 children once nearly starved, a woman who once gave birth in silence, now sitting around the same table, and no one wanted to leave early. In the afternoon, Clay stood atop the hill, his eyes following the road that led back to town, not because he longed to leave, but as if he were saying goodbye to the man he used to be. Naomi came to stand beside him. She didn't speak, just handed him a small cloth, the one she'd kept since her husband died. Worn now, the edges frayed. "For the boy," she said. "Wrap his neck, keep him warm." Clay accepted it, his hand faltering for a moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you," said without voice. As the sun dipped, its red hue spilled across the prairie. Naomi sat on the front step. Clay sat beside her, a small space between them, nothing forced. She spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "When the snow comes, you can stay if you want." Clay didn't reply, but in the fading light he reached down, picked up a stalk of dry grass, and broke it gently between his fingers. That gesture, not a promise, but not a refusal either, just a man, staying one more day. And for those who've been left behind, who've lost trust, who once believed they had nothing left to offer, one more day together is already a short, hard-won spring. There's no need to say, "I'll stay forever," only to know someone hasn't left when the snow begins to fall.